Hi, everyone. It is your girl, Remi, and thank you for joining me for another episode of Self Centered. Today, I have a really cool guest. Her name is Darien, and today we are going to be talking about what history can teach us about who we are and who we want to become. Um, Darien knows a lot about history, so I'll let her introduce herself.
Hi everyone. I'm Darien. I am a third year PhD student and I study the history of Black education in the British West Indies. So, very excited to have this conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much again for joining me. I love the work that you're doing. Love your presence on social media, like how honest you are. So thank you again for joining me today.
It's good to be here. Yeah, thanks for the invite. Yeah, I was very excited to get it.
So I think a good place to start is kind of talking about what your PhD is going to be and what your project is. I know you touched on it a little bit, but kind of digging deeper into that.
Yeah, whatever I say here is it definitely is a work in progress and I am in the process of learning what my project will be.
Mhm.
But at the moment, I study schools that were built underneath homes in Guyana, which is where I'm from. And I look at 20th century Guyanese history and the schooling that was happening during that time, pre and post independence, 1940s to the 1970s. And I just explore how the architecture of some homes in Guyana lent itself to being educational spaces and blurring that line between domesticity and education and looking at the dual purpose nature of homes in Guyana, basically. That's where we're at right
No,
now.
that's super cool. That is really cool. I love that. So, I think something that would be helpful to also start with is kind of defining like what history means. I think a lot of people have like a general idea like, oh, like it's this class I did in high school and old books and things like that. But I wonder if you could talk to us about your definition of history and maybe how that's changed over the course of your studies.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think like you, like when I was having history as part of like a subject, I thought history was the study of the past, just very vague. Very vague, just like the study
Yeah.
of whatever happened in the past. But my work does a lot with oral history, and I talk a lot with elders, educators, past students from the 1900s. Basically, this is when they were
Yeah.
students and teachers. And I think what I'm learning now is that history is not this kind of like stagnant thing that happens in the past and it is there and it hasn't changed or moved and that's it and then we just move forward, very linear, I guess, not thinking it's as linear and as stagnant. But I think talking to people, I realize like history is something that's actively being created in real time with the people that I'm
Yeah.
talking. As they're remembering their past, as they're remembering their experiences, they're in the moment actively building what history is and like the way they would like to tell it and the way they want it to be constructed and presented to other people. And so it's not this thing that does not change. It's not this stagnant thing, a thing that happened in the past and that is it. It is something that's constantly being constructed and created in real time.
Wow. I really like that definition. I think, at least for me, thinking about it as something that's constantly adapting, especially the piece about how people want their history to be presented. I think about my own education and how you get a textbook written by someone
Someone.
and you're hope that whatever they're portraying is going to be accurate, is going to be
Mhm.
representative of, what actually happened. And it's usually very one-sided. It's, someone is giving their version of events, but sometimes you don't hear from the subject of the story.
Yeah.
And so I really like that piece of ensuring that how people want their stories to be
Mhm.
represented is
Yeah.
is maintained.
That just made me think. And just some people are just like not subjects of history at all, like at all. I feel like a lot of the people that I talk to live in the villages that are, like a little bit away from the capital city, which is where I feel like most of history is told from Georgetown, the
Yeah.
capital. It is
Hmm.
where all the archives are housed, and also just where a lot of like the big decisions happen. Like Parliament
Yeah.
is situated there. A
Hmm.
lot of our like, you know, administrative buildings for the running of Guyana is there. And so I
Yeah.
feel like Georgetown's history gets told a lot more than the villages and the people who live in those villages on the outskirts of the capital. And so some people just don't even be, they're not even the subjects within
Yeah.
history at all. Yeah.
No, that's a really important piece because I think, especially in the times that we live in, thinking about how history is informing the present and possibly the future, whose history or stories get told are very important. And if there's an entire group of people, demographic, region that are not being told, we're missing out on so much a richness in the story of who we are, where we come from. And so I think whose stories get told is definitely very vital. And I'm glad you brought that up. So I kind of wanted to get a deeper understanding of what drew you to studying history. And like, obviously, you're from Guyana, so that kind of lends to why you might have chosen Guyana, but why you decided to study history.
Yeah. Prior to starting my PhD, I was a teacher in Harlem, New York. I
Hmm.
taught first grade. I was taking the lead for my grade on the writing curriculum. And at the time, I wanted to create a curriculum, a writing curriculum for first graders that explored Black resistance movements in the 60s. And when I started the idea, I was told this might be too big of a topic for 6-year-olds. Obviously I disagreed and went ahead with it. Anyway, part of building the curriculum meant that I was relying a lot on archives, a lot of old photographs of that time, documents, because I wanted my students to see what those documents actually look like, and like
Yeah.
I'll of course read them, read it to them or read it alongside them and stuff like that before they would get into the writing. So it's part about learning Black history before they would then apply their like writing skills to that with like
Okay.
prompts and things like that. So that was the first time I think I really thought about doing history as like part of my project. I in undergrad I studied sociology, and I think I was thought I was going to stay in that kind of field. But after doing the project, I was like, this is amazing. I had a great time putting together the curriculum. I learned so much. Well, to do the curriculum required me to kind of use a fine tooth comb to go through history in order to properly engage with it with my students. So I was like, it'd be cool to, with that same care, think about Guyanese history, the place that I grew up.
Yeah, no, that's really cool. And Black resistance is usually kind of there's this connotation that it's like a very negative topic or it's a very difficult topic. And so why did you want to teach kids, particularly that age group, that part of history? I know it went
Mhm.
along with their writing, but like what was kind of like why and what was the experience like? Like what were the kids' responses to the
Yeah.
lesson?
I got really good engagement with my students. I lucked out for sure. And I heard from the rest of the first grade classes too. I think because a lot of the material was new, we did not have any Black history curriculum at the school that I was teaching, but we served predominantly Black kids, and most of them came from Harlem. And that's not me trying to downplay my school in any way, but that's many schools across America, right?
Yeah,
And
for sure.
yeah, so I just noticed that it wasn't something that we were teaching students, and I can look at my students and see that the students really enjoyed it. I enjoyed it. Well, one thing that I learned with my first graders was that I went in thinking Black resistance looked a particular way. It was like protests in the form of marches. I think
Yeah.
I was thinking in a very limited manner. But through the curriculum, we explored Black resistance in the arts, in sports, in being able to do things that other people didn't think you should be allowed to do in the
Right.
most
Yeah,
like basic line. And Harlem is the perfect place for that with the Harlem
for
Renaissance.
sure.
And yeah, it was amazing. The children
Yeah.
really like, especially when we did the arts, when we did dance and music, they just really connected with it. And surprisingly, a lot of them were already thinking not necessarily about resistance using that word, but they could
Mhm.
understand the basic premise of fairness. That's a big part of teaching first grade, is how to be fair with your friends, how to be kind
Yeah.
to other people,
Mhm.
and things like that. So like when we boil down what the Black resistance movement was, love, care, kindness, fairness,
Mhm.
they understood those principles and they were already engaging with those principles as first graders with their friends.
Yeah. No, that's really, I really like that. And something that kind of came to mind was, I think, like you were saying, a lot of times in most schools in the United States, there's not a lot put into Black history or Black resistance. It's very much slavery. Slavery ended. Jim Crow. MLK.
Mhm.
The end. And I guess now they kind of throw in Black president, Barack Obama, the end. And
Yeah.
there's so much in there. And I really like the piece of like the resistance didn't just happen in the form of marches. It
Mhm.
was athletes taking a stand on various stages, whether it's the Olympics or local sports at home and the arts like I think there is a piece of resistance in just kind of reclaiming your story and telling your story as a Black person. And I think especially for first graders, and not like their first interaction with Black history not being the standard like list of events that happen.
Yes. Linear beginning to end.
Yes.
No, it kind of forced us to jump around a little bit. We did not start with like, oh, we're going to start in 1920s and go up to the 1960s. No, we based it on themes and moments. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, definitely.
That's really cool. And so I think, like history is found in like architectures, homes, oral histories, as you were kind of talking about. Can you talk more about like what the domestic spaces reveal about history and how that kind of connects to the schools being built in the basements, you said, of homes?
Yeah. Yes. And quick clarify, because I realized like, yeah, maybe some people don't know what these homes look like, but they are houses on stilts, and the area at the bottom is opened up. So it's like this open area of houses on stilts. So it's not really a basement like in the US where it's like underground. It is very much like above ground, this above ground
Yeah.
space. And I think what I'm learning the most is that I'm getting the opportunity to interview elders who currently live in these specific types of homes
Mm-hmm.
since like the 60s. Like they've been living in the same house since the 60s. Very much looks the same inside. Like they've got, I don't know if anyone's been in any type of West Indian home, but like
Mm-hmm.
the plush couches with the velvet patterns, yeah, or the
Yeah.
wooden cabinets with glass, and there's like all these like china inside of it and things like that,
Yeah. And you can't touch
just
it, eat
like
off
that.
of it,
You can't
nothing.
touch it. No, that's the fancy glasses, things like that. And what I'm learning doing this interview in this particular style of home is that when we're talking and we're talking about their experience growing up in Guyana or becoming a teacher in Guyana, it's not just the questions that are on my list of questions to ask them that's guiding me. It's also I can look up, look around, I can see a photo in a photo frame. I can see the cabinet with the glasses. I can look up and see the roof and see it look kind of like the inside of a wooden canoe and be like, "Is
Mm.
that a boat as your roof?" And then they'll be like, "Yeah, it's boat wood. It's boat wood that makes up
Wow.
that roof." And then that might stir a memory into like who they rented the home with, or the time that they went with their sister on this boat ride and they saw something really interesting. So I'm finding like the home almost like triggers memories. And if you are like as a researcher curious not just with the person in front of you or just the questions in front of you, but curious about their environment and what they choose to surround themselves with, it can open up a whole new pathway into the types of stories that you can receive from them.
And so, you spoke a lot about like interviews and speaking with people, which I think is quite different from like at least my impression of history going to some sort of textbook or archive to read about what happened, you're kind of getting the history from the horse's mouth. And
Yes.
so, can you give us like a clear definition of oral history and what really differentiates it from like the written stuff that we are usually interacting with?
Such a big question. The definition of oral history, history that is oral. No, it's hard for me to define it, but I will say about oral history, especially thinking about it on alongside the archives. And this is something I learned because when I started, I thought whatever was written, whatever was put in words was more valuable than anything that was said. I think once it's in words, then that must be truth. Once it's in words,
Yeah.
that that gives it validity. That
Yeah.
gives it, I almost want to say superiority over any other method out there. Had to unlearn that very quickly because when I walk
Mhm.
into the National Archives in Guyana, the
Mhm.
things that are written and put down, one, they're not very thorough or very inclusive.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
they're literally disintegrating in real time. Like we are as a country, well, I don't want to speak for the country, but as someone who is in the archives, and I know the National Archives is working on this, is like digitizing our national archives is like an ongoing project because our facilities cannot handle some of the documents that we do have, and they are, in real time, like anything, changing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, changing and going through its own life cycle to say. But I had to really unlearn that not just because it's words that means it's like superior or valid or more valid than any other method out there. And once I started speaking to people because there were things I wasn't finding in the archives or at least not a lot of details,
Yeah.
it's about thinking about which method I would like to center in my research, and that was oral history and making archives complementary to the things that
Mm.
I'm learning from people who've actually lived that history and are still around to tell it. Yeah.
Wow.
So I
No,
can't
that's
really
really
tell you the definitions. I can tell you
yeah.
how it works with the archives.
Yeah. And the reason why I was asking was because I think a lot of times oral history can be looked down upon. I don't know, like a lot of times we think about like, oh, well, are there any written languages in Africa? Or like written languages besides like the language of the colonizers in the West Indies? And I feel like the majority of what I've learned about my own personal history of my family has been
Hmm.
grandparents telling parents, parents telling kids, older
Hmm.
cousins telling younger cousins, and you kind of just piece together like this patchwork history of
Yeah.
your family. And so to see that that's valid,
Yeah.
because a lot of times you think about it personally, you're like, yeah, grandma or grandpa said this, but that's their version of events. I don't really know if that's what actually happened.
Right.
It's really refreshing to see that, like, in scholarly work, quote unquote, because a lot of times what we define as scholarly or proper academic work was defined hundreds of years before us.
Hmm. Hmm.
But I really like that oral history has a place in scholarly work.
Yeah. And I like what you said. It's like, yeah, like when grandma talks, grandpa or whatever, you're like, yeah, for all you know, they're embellishing and whatever, whatever, whatever. But I think we only scrutinize stories, oral stories, whether from our grandparents or from even in academia, we scrutinize it a little bit more. We're like, oh, like
Mhm.
they must be embellishing and like they don't remember and blah blah blah. But even our written archives or written the stuff in the archives that are written down are someone wrote them.
Yes.
Someone wrote them, and they also are making decisions about what they're putting down on that paper. And so those questions that we're having, which are so important, should be
Mhm.
asked for any data that we're using in order to do our research.
Yeah.
And yeah, and the archives really is shaped by power. It is
Mhm.
a power dynamic happening there at play in real time. Even when we are engaging with materials in the archives, everything is being filtered through our own lens and our own experiences and things like that. So
Yeah.
like, yeah, like we can ask those questions about what our grandparents told us and also believe that what they tell us is their telling of history, just like anything
Mhm.
else that we engage with. It is a
Yeah,
telling of history. Yeah.
yeah, for sure. And something else that you said towards the beginning that kind of struck me was how the space that people exist in can shape the way they tell stories and their histories. You mentioned like the person looking up and being like, "Oh yeah, that was built out of boatwood." And so how else do the spaces that we're in kind of shape how history is told or retold to people in your experience?
That's something I'm trying to figure out. That is the
Mm.
project. That really is the project. There are a lot of ways of thinking about it, like the one example I shared, but also like how spaces can shape a researcher's methods and a
Mm.
way to help the storytellers. It might trigger something in the storytellers like mind or memory as you're looking around and being really curious about the objects that they choose to surround themselves with. I think also for my project I'm learning like the schools that I'm looking at are built on their homes, and it's hard to think that a school that is built under a home would be separated from the home in that way. So it's almost
Yeah.
like the people who lived above the house are as much a part of the story as the school that is existing underneath it. And so, what is that like line between the two? I guess it is a blurry line, and it's something that I'm
Yeah.
exploring. I'm also thinking about this particular architectural feature was a home that was so familiar throughout Guyana. So, what does it mean if a teacher lives in this style of home, uses her
Hmm.
own bottom house, the bottom of the house, for gatherings or cooking or meeting up with friends and gossiping underneath there, and then going
Yeah.
to school that is also underneath the house? Do you carry with you those experiences that you have under with your own home into a school that is part of a home? Do you see familiarity with people in the same way because you exist with people in that space in your own house in the same way? A lot of questions and no answers. Lots of questions, lots of questions.
I think that is the burden of research is you answer one question and that spawns 20 other questions.
Yeah.
Like even as you were talking about, like there is a intimacy there. Like if that's their home and they're using the bottom portion of it to teach,
Yes.
what do they carry? Like if you, I don't know, had a fight with your husband
Yeah.
and now you got to teach class in like 10 minutes. Like there is no drive to school where you can kind of blow off steam.
No, no, no. You gotta go downstairs and get it done. No, for sure.
Yeah. And so I think that kind of spawned another question to me, and maybe this is a very naive question. Because typically you see like school houses, like when we think about education, it's this separate building from our home, very detached. And so can you say like why was this a common practice
Mhm.
in Guyana?
Yeah. Well, for one, a lot of the like history of education in Guyana is usually talking about like the church schools, the because missionaries were like very prevalent in the history of education of the British West Indies, the ones sent by the colonial government
Hmm.
into the islands and so forth.
Hmm.
And so, one, this is a telling of a history that was not really seen as legitimate education, was not really seen as a part of the formal schooling system, was not
Okay.
necessarily funded by the government, did not have the backing of the church because they had their own separate institutions happening in real time. But from the people that I'm talking to, I'm learning no, for these villages and these communities, this was a legitimate institution. This was the school in the area. This was where all the children went from their village and from villages next door. A lot of my storytellers have different reasons why the schools were important. One, it filled a gap. A lot of, especially when you think about secondary school or high schools, as the America would, like in the US, they would call it, existed in the capital, and children had to travel by train into the capital in order to have a secondary education. So having
Hmm.
high school, a secondary school in your village that is there, it helped fill that gap. And it wasn't a separate institution. I've heard from founders of bottom house schools being like, I don't want to spend money on building a whole new building
Mm.
to put a school in, that when I could take that money and put it towards the students when I already
Yeah.
have a home that I can use as a classroom. So there are like many reasons why the bottom house became such an important part of people's communities, even if it's not necessarily mentioned in the archives or in the traditional telling of history of education in Guyana.
Oh wow. No, that I didn't realize that these were kind of, in a way, an act of resistance against colonization because they weren't really supported
Mhm.
by the crown.
Yes. Even if
So
they
that's
sometimes taught the same, they would teach the colonial curriculum. It wasn't, I guess, when I started this project, I was like, oh my gosh, complete resistance,
yeah,
like against the British colonial system, complete. But what I'm learning is that it's more like these bottom house schools existed alongside as well the colonial system, the colonial education system. They would teach curriculum. Sometimes they believed in some of the values that you might find in one of the church schools, like you must speak proper English or things, and or reading or having textbooks from the British system being brought over
yeah,
is good, right? But in a way, at the same time, that I'm learning with
mhm,
this, it's not one or the other, resistance or non-resistance. It's
yeah,
just yes, and we are engaging with the system and also creating spaces that don't necessarily exist in our villages. So yes, and
yeah. No, I do like the idea of yes and because I think as a scientist, my training, my mind is geared toward either it is or it isn't.
yeah.
But I work with cells, I work with biological systems, and they are not in the business of being binary. Most of life that I have seen has been somewhere in the middle. It's a combination of things. And so I really appreciate that yes and like, yes, they're engaging with the colonial system because that is what is there, but they're also finding ways to maintain their own agency, I guess you could say, or autonomy in a way because, like you said, why should they spend all this money just moving people to a building
Mhm.
away from their homes
Yeah.
when that money could be invested in the actual students? And a lot of times we don't think about that. We think about these fancy buildings and how they're going to foster all of this intellectual curiosity and collaboration. But sometimes it's like, no, we need to do for who's here and invest in them as much as possible. And something that I kind of wanted to also ask about was you were saying a little bit about how some of the teachers and maybe even the students kind of participate in the colonial system by saying, yeah, the books that they're bringing are doing a good for us. And so I guess the question kind of leans into how colonialism or the history of that kind of shapes not only what's remembered, but like how things kind of still exist today. Like, I think something that comes up a lot, not just in the West Indies, but many other countries, especially when you think about immigration into America, there's
Mhm.
this need to kind of conform or be like, this is a good thing, like speaking the Queen's English or the King's English and not having that accent. Whereas I find that I think that's the beauty of who we are
Mhm.
as West Indian people, as people from other countries. And I know this is becoming a very convoluted question now, but it's like, how do you see that history kind of shaping not only what's remembered, but kind of who people are still?
Today, yeah. 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 Well, at least I will speak for what I know about Canada, but the British influence is still very much here.
Okay.
Here. It's kind of baked into some of our systems, our judicial system, our educational system for sure. You can still see some of the schools that were only for white people and then only for
Mm,
white boys. And then now, yes, African Guyanese students are going there, Indo Guyanese, just, non white Guyanese are now attending those schools. But or
mhm,
and at the same time taking a lot of the same exams that were around, like I when I'm talking to the storytellers and they're telling
mhm,
me the 1940s, teaching
Hmm.
kids to take an exam. I'm like, I took that exam. I took that exam, and students are still taking that exam every year.
That's crazy.
So some things have stayed the same, but I think what I'm learning is that like Guyanese people are very nuanced group. Just a very
Yeah.
they can hold many truths at the same time.
Mhm.
They can your grandparents can be giving you herbal medicines that they got from the garden, and then at the same time telling you to pronounce your letters properly, your words properly,
Yeah.
right? Those two
Yeah.
things are existing at the exact same time. So yes, I would say there's still like some colonial legacies very much baked in.
Hmm.
And at the same time, people have adapted, people have taken, molded, changed, warped, all of those words um, to create a life for themselves and a life of their own. And so, yeah, I appreciate the nuance of West Indian people for sure.
Yeah. No, I really like that.
Yeah.
West Indian people are very nuanced.
Yes.
Many truths exist at the exact same time. And I think that that's also kind of a part of the resistance. Like we can see, but also be like, this is not necessarily what we want for ourselves. And I don't think that's the same as cherry picking, but I think nuance is the like most appropriate word that I can think of at the moment. And so as we kind of like round out the conversation, something that is coming up for me because I've seen a lot of the videos on like TikTok and Instagram reels about like missing like the old days, like oh, back when there wasn't any social media, when there's no AI and this and that. Like I how do we distinguish between, preserving history? Obviously, like when you're preserving actual documents, artifacts, that's one thing. But as we kind of tell the stories and kind of there's of course some comedy to it because people put their own flavor in everything. As West Indian people, we tend to season everything, even our stories.
Yeah.
How do we preserve history without crossing that line of romanticizing it? Because I think a lot of times, at least in the United States, history is very much romanticized. We were talking earlier about like, oh yeah, the civil rights era, they were marching peacefully, and yes, they were hosed down, but we're not going to talk about that
Talk about that part.
because we have like we have MLK, and then we have Barack Obama, and it's all great.
Yes.
Like within the context of your work, I know like that's where you can speak from. How do we or how do you distinguish between preserving versus romanticizing it?
Yeah, good question. That is something I'm like learning in my program every time I write a paper. I think about that. I think
Mhm.
about, am I only showing the good side? Am I only talking about the good side? Which is, I'm putting on quotations marks, but like, am I only putting the parts that just like sound like, oh, the past was a great place to be? Like it was,
Yeah.
and sometimes when I talk to some of my like storytellers, they talk
Hmm.
a lot about how much they enjoyed their childhood. Like how much with everything, they'd be like, yeah, there was like a hunger strike happening in 1963. And also I just had a great childhood. I just had a great childhood. And in a way, I guess they have romanticized their own past, if I want
Hmm.
to use that word. I'm separating this from like the romanticizing that we sometimes see on social media
Yeah.
and what some of these history books be doing, which is to me
Yeah.
erasure, not just romanticizing, but that is erasure. What I'm talking
Yes.
about is someone looking back at their past and remembering the good times, how
Mhm.
happy they were, how much they enjoyed being a kid growing up in Guyana. And I think there's a place in my retelling of their stories for that, for people to know that they had a good life, that yeah, Guyana, we're dealing with a lot of things happening here. It's not, you know, flowers and rainbows and butterflies or whatever here, but it is nice to hear that people loved their childhood, that they had fun, they enjoyed going to school, they had great friends, they loved their teachers. Corporal punishment was a big thing back then. They said, yeah, I love my teacher. And I think in in the writing of history, or at least with my project, it is about including the context of what was going on at the time, but it's also
Mhm.
important to mention that people really, the people I'm talking to enjoyed growing up here and enjoyed going to school here, even with everything else going on. And so there needs to be place for both of those sides.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. It sounds like they've reclaimed a lot of their own narratives, that it wasn't just these things that were happening to me and it was all bad. They still lived a very full life
Yeah.
next to all of these historical unprecedented events.
Yeah.
I like that, again, that adds like nuance and spice, if you will, to the story. And something that I like that's been that I've been thinking about for a while. How are you meeting your storytellers? Like maybe this is a stupid question, but I'm trying to think, if I were a PhD history student, how would I go about meeting people?
That's a good question. I meet storytellers through word of mouth. I speak to one person, and then they remember a friend that they're still in contact with who went to the same school, and then I'll sit down with the friend or the cousin, or people, just word of mouth. So that's like
Yeah.
one way. The other way is I show up. I put myself out there into situations that require me to meet new people. So, for example, there is a wonderful historical conference that happens here in Guyana every summer, and I've participated for the past 2 summers. And I not only participate by, seeing what other people are presenting, but I also present my own work. And yeah, this summer I met someone who heard my presentation and said, "Yeah, my grandfather started a bottom house school, and I think you should talk to my brother. He knows a lot about it." So it's when I least expect it, when it's not like I went in hoping to get people to talk to, but just putting my work out there, putting myself out there. You find your people. You find your
Yeah.
people, but you only find your people, or they'll only find you if you're out there. Really, if you really put
Yeah.
yourself out there. So that's another way. And then the third way, and it's a way that I feel like I need to celebrate a lot more and just say, like, my parents have been a huge help. My mother especially, she's the one, like, she drives me to all my interviews. And
Mhm.
if I know someone and I'm like, "Hey, have you heard of this person?" She's like, "Oh yeah, like this person was related to this person, or I've heard this family name before." There's a lot of, like, in Guyana, it like your last name matters because people trace who you are and where you're from through it. So it's
Yeah.
things like that. So having, like, my mother's support through this all, like, she sent me a Facebook post the other day of a woman happened to be talking about the school that I'm exploring, and she was like, "Isn't this the school you're exploring?" I was like, "Yeah." And I reached out to the person who made the post, and she became one of my storytellers. So it's just like having a supportive, like, mom who sees my project and sees how excited I am about it and is invested in it too. And I can't do it without her. So that's the other way.
Oh,
I'm
that is so awesome.
yeah.
No, I love that. That is great. I love that. That's so sweet. You know, there's nothing like a mom
Yeah.
who's like supporting her child. I love that she drives you to your interviews. I think I saw a video on your Instagram.
Yeah.
I was like, I love that because it really does take a village. Like, and maybe this is me just being nostalgic and kind of projecting that nostalgia on you. When I defended my dissertation and I look back and I was like, oh man, the amount of times my mom just listened to me complain about the science and this is not working and blah blah blah. But anywho,
Yeah.
I love that. It sounds like your project takes on kind of the piece of oral history, like that word of mouth connection and just integrating yourself into Guyana.
I left and moved to the US and created a whole nother life there. And this project, this dissertation has become the opportunity to kind of reintegrate myself back into Guyana, and to it is coming home. It really is just coming
Mhm.
back home, and figuring out who I am now, not only as a scholar of Guyanese history, but it's also of, like, a child of Guyana, like relearning that and, like, getting resettled. And so part of that is building and maintaining the community even when I'm not here, like with my storytellers and things like that. I leave for 9 months to go back to school, and I
Yeah.
make sure that, like, I'm exchanging pictures and I'm calling them and using WhatsApp. Thank you, WhatsApp. To keeping me in contact because I know when I come back in the summer, especially like my storytellers that live here, I have a few to live, US and Canada, but the ones also who live here, I need them to know when I come back, I want to see you. I want to go to the
Yeah.
market with you and I want to see what projects you're working on. I have one storyteller, his daughter is an artist. I love seeing her work. I love going to her studio. I love going to their farm. Like it is staying connected and it takes work. It's not easy. It's like not these kind of like, oh, just because we talked last summer, we're friends now and I don't need to do anything to maintain the relationship.
Mhm.
So and I think that helps with the meeting new storytellers. It is about showing that you're not just there, or I'm not here just to like try and take a story and then disappear off of the face of the earth.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is a long-term relationship I'm building with with the people here.
Wow. That is amazing. And
Yeah,
I think that's like the perfect note to end on. Thank you so much, Darien, for coming and talking to us about history and community. It sounds like integrating yourself into these communities and reclaiming stories and how the act of preserving history, the act of educating yourself, younger generations, is an act of resistance. I'm so excited for your work and everything that's going to come from it. So I definitely want us to stay in contact. I definitely want to see more of your journey. And so thank you all for joining me again on another episode of Self Center. I hope you got something from this. This was a super rich conversation. And be sure to follow me on TikTok and Instagram. And I am streaming everywhere that you listen to a podcast. Bye.